Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face.
So my next interview is with Bob Logan. He's a professor, scientist, and elementary particle physicist. Did I get that right, Bob? I sure hope so. You're either rolling your eyes right now or you're smiling with me. But he's a professor emeritus in physics at the School of the Environment and St. Michael's College, U of T. He's worked with Marshall McLuhan. He's had lunch with Niels Bohr, for heaven's sakes. You got to listen into this conversation. But the reason we came together today on this interview was to talk about a play at the Soul Pepper Theatre in Toronto, soulpepper.ca, where a play called Copenhagen is going to be playing in the very near future. And it's a conversation between Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. And there's speculation around what this conversation was all about and what it had to do with, anything. And so it's Bob's a consultant on the play. And we got into a little bit about the play, but we talked about so much more. We talked about science, and we talked about the importance of the Heisenberg principle and why Niels Bohr was such a big part of that. We talked about abstract science and Chinese inventions and about why theories are important and how God doesn't play dice with the world. We talked about the ethics of science and why it's important to actually step into these things and be intentional and be focused and be committed to a worldview and to a particular way of seeing the world. And Bob, boy did I learn a lot in this interview. I think you're going to really enjoy it. One of the things that we wind up talking about near the end of the view is this idea of being an interdisciplinary thinker and bringing things together in a complementary way. And so, don't get too specialized, says Bob, and you're going to want to step into this. Don't forget davidpecklive.com for more information about my writing and my speaking. You can also find out more about what I'm doing on patreon.com, and you can get behind the work that I'm doing and support it financially. And if you can't do that, I totally understand, but boy, would we appreciate, a review on iTunes or Google Play. That would really be helpful. And don't forget to rabble.ca for more information about other podcasters, other bloggers, other people that are doing similar kind of work that I'm doing, and they're there, rabble.ca. Dig into it if you can. And by the way, if you're looking to advertise on a podcast, why don't you choose Face to Face? I'm at over 1 million downloads, and we have a presence on the web. You're gonna want to find out a little bit more about that. Reach out to us through the website, and don't touch that dial. Bob Logan coming right up on all things scientific and the new play in Toronto, Copenhagen. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We're joined by a very special guest here with us today. Robert K. Logan is here with us. I guess some would call him Dr. Logan, but he's allowing me to call him Bob here today. Bob, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate you joining us on Face to Face.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. I always like talking about science. I want to popularize science and make people comfortable with dealing with science, which is why I got involved with the project at Soul Pepper.
Well, and probably why you're Professor Emeritus in Physics at the University of Toronto, School of the Environment, and St. Michael's College, I believe. And I'm sure there's a whole other list of bullet points on your CV that I'm sure you could share with us. But that's at least a decent overview, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but I'll share one more.
Okay, go.
I'm the chief scientist at the Strategic Innovation Lab at Ontario College of Art and Design.
So I have to say I did a little bit of research on you beforehand, and I'm dying to know which photograph I have of you is the most accurate, just so you know. But atmospheric physics, biological physics, condensed matter physics, Earth atmospheric, and planetary physics. The one
None of those apply.
None of those are you?
Nope. I'm an elementary particle theorist.
Oh, you're an wow. Okay. I was just trying to sound smart.
Those are wonderful fields, but not mine.
Not yours. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your field before we talk about the play that you're involved in at Soul Pepper Copenhagen. You're a consultant on that, opening I think in April of this year, playing for about 4 or 5 weeks, and you've been brought in as a consultant on the play because you actually had lunch with Niels Bohr, who's one of the 3 characters in the play, as some of us probably already know. But why don't you? And then of course we need to talk about Marshall McLuhan and poetry and physics, and there's so many things we're going to get into. But tell us a little bit about your background and about this. Sorry, I've forgotten already. Elementary particle physics.
Right. Well, I was an undergraduate and graduate student at MIT, and I did my research in elementary particle physics. That's trying to understand the behavior of the tiniest things that we are made of, which are quarks, electrons, protons, neutrons, and a whole host of particles, mesons, baryons. The list goes on and on. I became interested in science at a very young age. When I graduated primary school, I was asked what I wanted to be when I grow up, and I said I want to be a nuclear physicist. So I made that dream come true, and it was while I was at MIT as an undergraduate in my first year that I actually met Niels Bohr. I was sitting in the lunchroom when he walked into our cafeteria for lunch. He was all by himself. And I was sitting with my classmates, and I said, "Oh, my God, there's Professor Bohr, and he's all by himself. We should keep him company." And my friend said, yeah, Bob. And I said, "Well, I'm going to keep him company." And I jumped up and joined him on the line and stood behind him, and I said, "Good afternoon, Professor Bohr." And he wheeled around and introduced himself and said, "Hello, I'm Niels Bohr." And I said, "Well, hello, I'm Bob Logan." He said, "Will you join me for lunch?" And I said, "It would be a pleasure." So when Soul Pepper, I heard that they were going to do the play Copenhagen, I decided to contact them and see if I could be of some help. Now, I was familiar with the play Copenhagen because in 1971, I started a course at the University of Toronto called The Poetry of Physics and the Physics of Poetry. The Poetry of Physics was teaching physics to humanities students without mathematics. And the Physics of Poetry is to discuss literature that has to do with science. So we looked at the poetry of Shakespeare and John Donne and saw how they dealt with the physical world. And one of the texts that I used in my course was the play Copenhagen.
Well, okay.
And we actually had a reading of the play in the class. I assigned the students to different parts. And so I was quite familiar with the text, and I think it's a very important play, and one I hope that your listeners will attend.
So just before we dive into why you think it's an important play, because I really want to know more about it, I've read the play quite a few years ago, but I've never actually seen the performance, and I'm definitely going to be hoping to get down to see it. In fact, I might have to twist your arm for some free tickets there, Bob. But we can talk about that later. How, pray tell, did you know that you wanted to be a nuclear physicist at such a young age?
I have no idea. I was just curious about how the world was made up.
But why not? But why not biology? Why not? There are a lot of other sciences, right? A lot of hard sciences. That sounds really specific for somebody so young. Was it film? Was it books that you were reading at the time? Was it?
Well, I heard about Einstein, so I went to our public library and took out a book by Einstein, which I had trouble understanding naturally. When I was only 13 years old.
Right.
But I was determined to figure out what that was all about.
So when I was 13, I'm just trying to think of what I was doing. I think I started reading philosophy at a pretty young age, but it wasn't 13. But I'd like to think I was probably asking some good questions. I think I was skateboarding. I was doing a little bit of sleight of hand magic, and maybe even still playing with a bit of Lego. I'm not sure.
Well, I was doing all the kid stuff. In fact, when I was in high school, one of my friends said to me, "You know, for an egghead, you're amazing because you can play basketball too."
Egghead meaning a little too big of a brain. Is that what you're
Yeah,
talking about?
right.
Yeah, right. Got it. Got it. Love the fact that you've actually. I mean, it's so amazing to me that you had lunch with Niels Bohr. Did you stay in touch with him after that? Was it a one-off meeting, or did it
It was a
go any?
one-off meeting, but later in life, I met his son Agabor
Mm,
at Los Alamos Labs in New Mexico, and on a trip to Copenhagen, where I was asked to be the external examiner of a student, I contacted Thomas Bohr, the grandson of Niels Bohr. So I met the whole Bohr family.
So what do you take away from a lunch like that? Do you come away from that just inspired? Were you feeling was it a reality check for you, or what kind of guy was he like? I mean, yeah, I know you can only tell so much, I suppose, over lunch, but what any insights?
Well, it was very touching that such a famous person would take time for a
Mm,
first student and encourage me, and I guess he made me feel like I could do something in physics.
right.
I guess based on the questions I was asking.
And were you able to share with any of that with him over the lunch, or was it more of a you just kind of more adulation and so thrilled to meet you kind of a lunch?
Well, I asked him about what he was doing in Denmark,
What he was doing in
what
Denmark.
questions he was working on.
Right. That should be the title of the play. What were you doing in Denmark?
Um, the thing about Niels Bohr is he's just such a beautiful soul. He was sort of the spiritual godfather of
Hmm.
quantum mechanics in the first part of the 20th century. And when I say godfather, I don't mean like in the mafia. I
Hmm.
mean a spiritual leader.
Tell me why the play, and maybe even, and this comes out in the play, I suppose, we're talking about a meeting that Heisenberg and Bohr had many years ago. There's all kinds of nuclear implications, etc. I'm sure you're gonna tell us a little bit more about those. But why is this play important? Is it important because of the questions it asks, because of the issues that it talks about, and how relevant they still are today? Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Well, it's important because Heisenberg was probably there to try and get something from Bohr to help him in his project to develop a nuclear bomb for Hitler.
Hmm.
And as is related, as soon as Heisenberg brought up this topic, Bohr immediately cut off the conversation. Now, Niels Bohr is anything but rude. I mean, if you took the time to talk to a first-year student over lunch, he certainly wouldn't be rude to Heisenberg,
Mm.
who he had worked with for many years before the Nazi era. Heisenberg developed his idea of the uncertainty principle while working with Bohr at the Bohr Institute in Copenhagen. In fact, I believe that Bohr had a influence on Heisenberg's uncertainty principle because Bohr developed a concept called complementarity. He said that a particle, like an electron,
Mm-hmm.
can behave sometimes like a wave and sometimes like a particle. And that light, which we generally think of as a wave, can sometimes behave like a particle. And this is an important part of the uncertainty principle. Heisenberg never gave credit to Bohr for his contribution to developing the idea. But Bohr is certainly someone without whom quantum mechanics would not have developed the way it did.
Obviously the play has practical implications for theater company and for selling tickets and for, people going out on the town and enjoying an evening out and theater subscriptions and all those kinds of things. How does something like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, complementarity, how do those things play out in my life? I'm not a scientist, I understand the importance of it, the value of it, and boy, am I glad there are people like you out there.
We're talking about things that happen at the subatomic level.
Right.
Not part of our everyday experience. However, the way quantum mechanics affects you is that the computers you use, the smartphone you use, are all based on solid-state physics, which is based on quantum mechanics.
Mm.
Now, Bohr and Einstein had a fantastic argument over the years about whether quantum mechanics was a complete theory or not. Einstein said, well, with the uncertainty principle and quantum mechanics is based on probability, it's not a complete theory because he said God doesn't play dice.
Right.
And Niels Bohr said, look, we have a way of describing nature. It might not conform to the way we thought about large particles, like billiard balls, but it works. It's practical. He's quoted to have said to one of his students who was talking about these philosophical questions, he said, oh, shut up and just calculate. Of course, he said it in a jovial, joking kind of way. It's like, you can talk about how many angels on the head of a pin if you like, or why quantum mechanics is not a complete theory because it has uncertainty. But on the other hand, it works. It helps us understand nature better.
And would you say that was one of the, and sort of coming back full circle to one of my earlier questions about your level of interest, that was your curiosity. You were looking to figure out how it all worked?
Yes, I was.
You wanted to see the nuts and bolts?
Yes, I was trying to understand how it worked. But then as life went on, and with teaching the poetry of physics, I became interested in philosophical questions and what we do with this knowledge that we're gaining.
Mm.
And that led me to develop a study of future studies. Just before I got tenure, my chairman asked me, Bob, we'd like you to teach this summer. I said, yes, sir, no problem. I had not much of a choice, right?
Right.
And I said to him, but sir, I taught last fall, I'm teaching now in the spring, I'll teach in the summer, and then I'll teach again in the fall and the spring. I said, that's a long time without a break. Do you think I could have the next winter term off? Oh, sure, Bob, no problem. So I thought to myself, I'm going to avoid the Canadian winter. And I thought I'll go to Italy or Israel and where the weather is nice and avoid a Canadian winter. Well, then I discovered that it's not so warm in January and February in those places. And then I hit upon the idea of going to Mexico and study with Ivan Illich, the futurist.
Mm-hmm.
And it was there that I became a futurist. And I came back to the University of Toronto and suggested that future studies would be an ideal interdisciplinary study for one of the colleges. And I wrote a report to the president, who had given me $500 to travel down to Mexico. And 2 weeks later, I was asked to start a program at New College and future studies. So I started recruiting some of the more interesting professors at the University of Toronto. Don Chant, the guy that started Pollution Probe, was one of my recruits. Ken Hare, who was the director of the Institute of Environmental Studies, and Arthur Porter, who was a chair of the Industrial Engineering Department. And when I saw Arthur Porter, he said, "Hey, we have to get Marshall McLuhan involved." And I said, "Wow, that would be incredible." So he telephones Marshall and tells him, "Bob Logan wants to start a future studies program at New College." And McLuhan said, "Is that the guy that teaches the poetry of physics?" And Porter said, "Yes." And McLuhan said, "Send him over. I want to have lunch with him." So off I go to meet Marshall McLuhan. And we go to the faculty cafeteria. And no sooner did I put my tray down on the table than he said to me, "What have you learned in the poetry of physics?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if I've learned anything yet, but I'm working on an interesting problem, trying to understand why abstract science began in Europe and not in China, because the Chinese invented so many things." And I reeled off a list of Chinese inventions, which include silk, paper, ink, gunpowder, printing press, water wheel, windmill, magnetism, clockworks. And this upsets Italians, but noodles. And and so I thought, why did science begin in Europe and not in China, abstract science? And I told McLuhan, well, I thought monotheism and codified law might be the answer. The Chinese are spiritual, but they're not monotheistically inclined. They have laws, but it's not codified. And I said to McLuhan, combine codified law with monotheism, you get the idea of universal law. And McLuhan said to me, what else do we have in the West they don't have in China? And I just was stumped, and I said, I give up, I don't know. And he said, the alphabet. And I groaned, because I remembered how he connected the phonetic alphabet with deductive logic and abstract science in Greece. And so together we sat and chatted and wrote a paper together, which we called Alphabet, Mother of Invention. And that started my work with Marshall McLuhan, which lasted until he passed away in 1980.
I was going to say a long. I mean, I've looked at your CV and you've published a lot. You've written a lot about McLuhan and connected to the media and to language and so on. And it's it's really quite remarkable. And this started with another lunch meeting. So clearly, you've had a lot of success with lunch meetings, Bob.
Yes, lunch is good.
Any other people we need to know about that you've met over lunch in the last 30 or 40 years?
Well, this future studies program that I organized at New College, I called it the Club of GNU. GNU was the college mascot, and it was a takeoff on the Club of Rome, which was a group of industrialists and government leaders that were involved in future studies and wrote and sponsored a study called Limits to Growth. And those meetings, the Club of GNU met for lunch every Wednesday. And so again, lunch comes into.
Well, you know what's just so interesting to me about that is, the art of conversation and relating to people and just asking good questions, and isn't that what a great lunch is really all about, or a dinner, a breakfast meeting? It's not about the eggs and how they're cooked. It's about the conversation and the commiseration and the places you go to together. It seems to me I think that's a beautiful insight to even our conversation here today. That maybe the big takeaway here is we need to have we need to spend more time with people over good food. You know,
Who
that's not a bad
give credit
insight.
to Andrew Baines, who was a principal in the college, who said, you know, I'm going to serve a bottle of sherry at these luncheon meetings just to signal that this is a social event. This is a time to relax. We don't have to have, the academic usual "I got you" kind of conversation.
Right. No, that's excellent.
Yeah.
I'll start bringing sherry to more of my lunch meetings. I think that's a good idea.
I,
Tell me a little
By the
bit.
way,
Yeah.
that Club of Gnu gig led to my political career, which maybe your audience would be interested in knowing about.
Yeah. No, I don't. That didn't come up in my research.
Well,
Most elementary particle physicists I know are not also politicians.
I was a policy wonk.
A policy wonk.
Yeah. I would invite people from Ottawa, civil servants, to come to the Club of Gnu and give reports about what the government was doing. And one of the fellows that came mentioned my name to one of the members of Parliament named Paul McRae, who Trudeau had charged with looking at the futures portfolio. And so McRae started, whenever he was in Toronto, would look me up and we'd have a conversation. And one time he said, "How would you like to be the policy chair for the Liberal wing of the Ontario wing of the Liberal Party?" And I said, "Great." He said, "Well, now you got to get elected." So I had to go around and meet different people in the party, and I became the policy chair and was one of Trudeau's advisors.
Wow, how long did you sit in that position?
For about 2 years.
2 years. It's an interesting. I mean, I think it's an interesting segue into a conversation about science and politics today, and where it kind of sits. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And before we hit the record button, we talked a little bit about fake news and some of the stuff going on south of the border. And it's not just south of the border. This kind of this kind of conversation, or skewed conversation, if I can say that, is kind of going on all over the world.
I think that was a cue for me to share my one-liner.
It was a cue, Bob. Thanks
yes,
for taking.
Really.
Yeah, and it's a good one-liner. I really want you to share it.
And I just thought of it today for some reason. My thought was, Mr. Trump, the reason there's so much fake news is because you are a fake president.
Yeah. And let's hope people tweet that out tonight. That's what I'm hoping.
Right.
We can get that out on social media. Fake news, or fake president equals fake news.
Right, or fake president generates fake news.
Or fake president generates fake news. Oh man, that's pretty funny. And
but let's back to being serious.
Yeah.
Let's talk about science and responsibility.
Well, yeah, science and responsibility, the ethics of it. Where does faith come into that? Does it even come into the conversation? I mean,
This is where Niels Bohr was so important, because Niels Bohr was the son of a philosophy professor. And Niels Bohr was not only a physicist, but he also studied philosophy. Very familiar with the philosophy of Soren Kierkegaard.
Oh, is that right?
Mm-hmm. And the morality of Niels Bohr was impeccable. When the Nazis were persecuting Jewish scientists and Jews in general, Bohr stepped up and organized a campaign to rescue these poor folks. And one of the people he rescued was my professor at MIT, Victor Weisskopf.
Wow.
So the another dimension of Copenhagen that's important is the social conscience of a scientist. Something that Niels Bohr had, and something which Werner Heisenberg did not have. I don't know how Werner Heisenberg could have worked on a project to develop an atomic bomb for Germany under the leadership of Hitler, knowing what was going on in Germany. And so that, to me, is the important dimension of the play Copenhagen.
So the ethical questions that arise as a result of the science that one chooses to do or to not do.
Right. The responsibility one has of one's scientific discoveries.
By any chance, did you work with John Polanyi at U of T?
Well, John Polanyi and I are both members of something called Science for Peace, which is a group of scientists at U of T that are concerned with peace studies. And we're also members of the Pugwash movement. The Pugwash movement is a movement of scientists, East and West Bloc scientists. It was started in 1956 in Pugwash, Nova Scotia, by Cyrus Eaton, the industrialist who made his fortune in Cleveland, but who grew up in Pugwash and had an estate there. And he donated that estate as a place where scientists could meet to discuss nuclear disarmament. And I only became a member of that organization in 1979. I guess I was invited because of my work with Trudeau and the Liberal Party. And that's how I know John Polanyi.
The reason I ask is I did my master's degree in philosophy at the University of Guelph, and I wrote on Polanyi's father, Michael Polanyi's notion of tacit knowing, and out of his text, Tacit Dimension and Personal Knowledge, that he wrote back in '58. But he one of his first essays that he wrote as a philosopher was Why Did We Destroy Europe? And it just, as soon as you talked about the social conscience of a scientist, that's kind of where I went.
So now I can go full circle around back to Bohr and Weisskopf. Weisskopf, who was Bohr's student, or someone that Bohr helped, my professor at MIT. Weisskopf was also a member of the Pugwash movement. And he and I and a group of other Pugwashers greeted Solzhenitsyn when he was released from Gorky. Solzhenitsyn was a dissident, a Soviet dissident, and he was kept in the city of Gorky, not allowed to mingle with people in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And in the 1988 Pugwash meeting, which was held in Sochi, Dagamis, in Dagamis, near Sochi. We all met up in Moscow and were taken by a chartered plane down to Sochi and then driven to Dagamis. And there we met Solzhenitsyn, who had just been released by the Soviet authorities. I think I'm getting Solzhenitsyn's name wrong.
You mean the pronunciation?
No, I mean I think Solzhenitsyn is an author. I'm thinking of someone else. The famous Soviet dissident that worked on the nuclear, worked on the hydrogen bomb project for the Russians.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. I can't pull that name out of a hat. I could try and dig that one up. But either way, a Soviet dissident.
Right.
It's remarkable the experiences, the lunches that you have had over the years, and the connections and the dots. And I think it's interesting, Kierkegaard, and to hear that Bohr was a a student almost of Kierkegaard or familiar with his work. I love Kierkegaard's line, and I've certainly used it before. But you live your life stepping into it. You make your choices. You are a socially conscious scientist by stepping into the future, and then you only really start to understand those choices when you look back. And you're looking back, I would imagine, and stepping into this play, Copenhagen, and what. I'm not going to try to reduce it to one question, Bob, but
I have a concluding remark.
What are people going to take away from the play?
One of the lessons that we can learn from all of this is that Niels Bohr was a scientist, but also a humanist. He studied philosophy. He was interdisciplinarian. Heisenberg, on the other hand, was totally focused on his career as a scientist. And it's very important that one does not become too specialized, so that one does not look at the other side of the coin. So, wisdom is as important as knowledge. In fact, more important. And the thing that Niels Bohr had was not only scientific knowledge, but wisdom. And the thing that Heisenberg lacked was the wisdom to know that what he was doing was wrong. And so I leave that thought with your audience.
No, it's a great place to end. Have you seen the play? This new version of the play.
I've seen it played in my class, the Poetry of Physics.
Oh, okay.
But I haven't seen it on stage.
So it's going to be at the Soul Pepper Theatre, I think, in Toronto. I think it's April 6th to May the 4th. Well, Bob, certainly appreciated the time we've spent together today. I really do appreciate. We've barely scratched the surface, but I love the insights. I love your sense of humor. I love the fact that you basically have given me another reason to start having more lunches. I say that with sort of a smile, but there's also a very, really sincere, I think that's a sincere and wonderful and just very human sort of insight. We've been talking with Dr. Robert K. Logan here today on Face to Face about Copenhagen and elementary particle physics and eating lunch together. Bob, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for spending this time with me. Goodbye, everyone.